Unrest in Ukraine has brought attention in the United States to communities of Ukrainian-Americans. Now, one of the largest is in the state of Pennsylvania, where the turmoil between Ukraine and Russia is affecting Ukrainian immigrants and their descendants.
VOA's Kane Farabaugh talked to Ukrainian-Americans in Pennsylvania and Chicago to find out what they really think about the crisis in their homeland. Here's a look at his conversation with On Assignment's Rebecca Ward.
There was a new wave of immigration, particularly to places like Pennsylvania, after the collapse of the Soviet Union.
Father Timothy Thompson leads the congregation at St. Mary's Ukrainian Orthodox Church in the Pittsburgh suburb of McKees Rocks. He says about 10 to 15,000 immigrants came to the area in the 1990s.
They came here for jobs, plus churches were sponsoring them, when the Soviet Union first collapsed.
Chicago's immigration in this large Ukrainian community here, that immigration started in the early 1900s and it progressed after World War II. So different waves, different sections of this immigration have influenced the way this community interacts and stays connected with their homeland.
And that connection is, it's also church-based, you might say, a very spiritual or religious population.
Yeah, I've done now 3 stories on the different Ukrainian communities in Pennsylvania and then in Chicago. And in each of these stories, and in almost everybody that I talk to, church is the center by which everything else sort of flows around in these communities.
The unrest in Ukraine comes during the Christian holy period of Lent. As Father Nalisnik leads his congregation in prayer and reflection, he admits his thoughts are sometimes with his family, still living in Western Ukraine. They are thoughts shared by most members of this immigrant community that number in the tens of thousands. Many are only 1 or 2 generations removed from the country they left.
The Ukrainians here support whatever efforts the Ukrainians in Ukraine are doing to keep that country free.
St. Nicholas business manager Phyllis Murin-Zapirnik says that in times of helplessness, the community turns to Father Nalisnik for guidance and wisdom.
To give hope that everything will be okay. Like we said in church, after Friday is coming Sunday, resurrection,
There were a couple of protests here in Washington. Were there any protests going on in the communities you visited?
There haven't actually been protests where I've actually interviewed and reported on in these Ukrainian communities. But I will say that they were very much focused on the March on Washington that occurred and the protest that happened there, I believe it was on March 6th. So I think a lot of the efforts haven't been localized or individual. Everybody wanted to make sure that they were going to Washington, D.C. to have a larger show of support.
New York City is also home to tens of thousands of ethnic Ukrainians. VOA's Adam Phillips spoke to a few of them in an area known as Little Ukraine in Manhattan's Lower East Side, including Tamara Oleksy, president of the Ukrainian Congress of America.
Well, the Ukrainian Congress Committee of America is an umbrella group of the over 1 million people in the United States of Ukrainian descent, either they're recent or going back a ways. And she seemed to believe that Ukrainians were of a unified feeling that the Russians should stay out and that independence was important, and they wanted to look more toward the democratic models of Western Europe and the United States rather than east toward Russia.
We call upon the United States to urge the International Monetary Fund and our European allies to provide the interim government with the necessary financing so that it can begin the restructuring its economic institutions according to OECD country norms.
Now, you spoke to one gentleman who worked at a diner, and he was expressing some concern about his family.
Yes, they were very concerned. Every day he was hearing dire reports from his mother that maybe some of these lines would be cut. And they wouldn't know what was happening. He was also talking about possibly going back to join the army if there really was a civil war between the eastern Crimean Peninsula Ukrainians and those in the west, in Kiev, where his family was from.
I think that it was pretty clear in talking to almost everybody that I interviewed or spoke with that there is no support for the use of U.S. military force in Ukraine. A lot of them tried to explain to me that there really isn't this divide between Eastern Ukrainians and Western Ukrainians. Everybody who lives in Ukraine is Ukrainian. And to that point, too, I think a lot of people also tried to make sure that they told me that there isn't this animosity or this hostility by Ukrainians towards Russians that live in their country. So I think a lot of the message that people are trying to send here is just to sort of get the truth out there, or at least get their feelings out there, to sort of counter some of the information that other sources are providing that might try to inflate a conflict where conflict does not exist.
Our thanks, as always, to VOA's Kane, Farabaugh and Adam Phillips.